Pushkin. Hey, it's Jake. Before we get into this episode, I want to let you know that you can now binge the entire season, ad-free, by becoming a Pushkin Plus subscriber. You can hear all 6 episodes before they're released to the public. Sign up for Pushkin Plus on the Deep Cover Apple Podcast show page, or visit pushkin.fm/plus. Your subscription also unlocks more early and ad-free content from other true crime shows coming later this year, like new seasons of Death of an Artist and Lost Hills, and a brand new true investigation called Where's Dia? Now, onto the episode. Previously on Deep Cover.
Greg, I can't just call a prosecutor over here and waste his time. You gotta tell us, what is it we're asking the prosecutor to come for? And that's when he says, I'm not the shooter, and I want immunity.
And so he starts telling us how it went down. That basically, that he and Tommy decided one night to go and find a black man, to kill that black man so that they could get their spiderweb tattoos as skinheads.
It was definitely a different type of case. You know, a skinhead coming to Philadelphia to kill somebody? A cowardly act.
The family and I thought that this would be good if we found at least what happened to him. Can't do nothing about it, can't bring him back, but at least we'll find out the truth.
Aron Wood was murdered in the spring of 1989. The case had been cold for almost 20 years, until 2008. That's when Tom Guybeson was put on trial. He stood accused of 4 charges: ethnic intimidation, carrying a firearm without a license, conspiracy to commit murder, and murder in the first degree. So far, I'd heard a great deal about the prosecution's case against him. And I wanted to hear the defense's case directly from the man who made it himself.
He's scared to death, Jake. They're taking away his life.
This is Mike Farrell. He was Tom Guybeson's lawyer. And he was quick to tell me just how precarious his client's situation was at the time.
He's facing life without parole. And the only comfort he has is that he's got this crooked Irish kid who's trying to help him.
Crooked Irish kid being you.
Correct.
Why do you call yourself a crooked Irish kid?
Well, I have a crooked face, Jake.
He means that quite literally, by the way. When he was just a baby, Mike had an operation, and as a result, the left side of his face is paralyzed. It's not apparent immediately, unless he smiles, and then you notice, because it's really only a half smile. When I arrived at Mike's house in Philadelphia, he was prepared to retry this case. And I'm being serious here. He had his opening remarks printed and laid out on the dining room table. He'd retrieved all the files from this case, boxes of it. And after a brief introduction, explaining his crooked face, as he called it, he launched right into his opening arguments.
I believe Tom Guybeson is innocent.
Tom Guybeson is innocent, he told me. Is. As if the trial were going on right now, in his dining room.
They had no physical evidence. They had no gun. They had nothing but the ear witnesses of scorned girlfriends and Craig Peterson, who had been made an offer he couldn't refuse to escape prosecution in return for full immunity.
Mike got worked up, red in the face, raised voice, leaning in close to me. At one point, he actually apologized for getting so animated, said he couldn't help it. I learned that over the course of his career, Mike had carved out a niche for himself, defending what Mike calls, quote, unpopular persons, people who might alienate a jury. He represented a bunch of skinheads, but also guys like Mumia Abu-Jamal, a black activist who was convicted of murdering a white Philadelphia cop. Mike was on his legal team, too.
At cocktail parties, criminal defense attorneys are always asked, how do you represent people who are accused of doing horrible things? My answer was, because I'm a sinner.
When you say you're a sinner, though, what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean that in a way that we're all sinners, or are you speaking specifically? Or
yes, we're all sinners. I'm a sinner, and ultimately, no one is the worst thing that they've done in their life.
One more thing that I should mention about Mike: years after he defended Tom, he was convicted of money laundering and attempted witness tampering in another case involving marijuana dealers. It's safe to say Mike's entire career, start to finish, defies convention. One of Mike's challenges in this case was to keep the jury from jumping to conclusions about his client, Tom Guybeson. The whole skinhead thing was potentially a liability. It threatened to bias the jury against Tom from the start. To counter this, Mike described Tom in a very specific way. You might recall, Tom once told a local newspaper that he was, at one time, a certain type of skinhead, a blue-collar skinhead. Mike claimed that this was a very important distinction.
Tom Guybeson was a blue-collar skinhead, and a blue-collar skinhead did not advocate racism. He advocated, frankly, not unlike our current MAGA, which is America first. Blue-collar skinheads do not advocate racism.
I had read that he had a Hitler tattoo, though, on his body.
He did. And at some point in his younger life, that was part of his ideology, but it was not his ideology when I represented him.
I haven't been able to speak with Tom directly about this. He never responded to my requests for an interview. But based on the court records, Tom got the Hitler tattoo after the alleged murder. I know this because before the trial even started, his lawyer, Mike, argued that the jury did not need to know about that tattoo, and the judge agreed. It was a win for the defense. Even so, it would be easy for a jury to make some snap judgments about who Tom Guybeson was and what he believed. It was Mike's job to preempt these judgments. Mike hoped that he could focus the jury's attention instead on what he saw as the problems with the prosecution's case.
This was a case that was absolutely backwards. Ordinarily, you have a murder, and law enforcement searches for the murderer. In this case, they started with the murderer and searched for a murder.
In other words, the feds had taken the rumor of a killing, linked it to a cold case, and blamed his client. That was the argument, anyhow. Mike didn't have to offer any answers. He didn't have to identify the, quote, real killer. All he had to do was create reasonable doubt, poke just enough holes in the prosecution's argument that jurors might start scratching their heads. And the thing about Mike is, he's really good at poking holes. This became apparent to me the minute I set foot in his dining room. But of course, it wasn't me he needed to convince. It was a jury of 12 Philadelphians back in 2008. His adversary was the legendary prosecutor Roger King. His audience was a courtroom packed with spectators. They included lawyers who'd come to witness this showdown, a Ron Wood's family who was praying for justice, and of course, the press was there too. Because this trial would make headlines. How could it not? A cold case, almost 2 decades old, had been resuscitated in rather epic fashion. And if the prosecution was to be believed, hate itself was on trial. I'm Jake Halpern, and this is Deep Cover Season 4, The Nameless Man. Episode 5, The Trial. The prosecutor in this case was Roger King, a legendary figure, a distant cousin of Martin Luther King Jr. He spoke with the cadence and the charisma of a big church pastor. Roger often made the papers. He tried high-profile cases. Back in the spring of 2008, the city's Criminal Justice Center was buzzing with the news that Roger King was trying his very last case. This drew a bunch of spectators, and one of them was another prosecutor named Carlos Vega. Carlos says he just had to be there.
It's almost like saying goodbye. It's a level of respect you're giving him, but also you're watching one of the greats do his last performance.
Carlos, like so many prosecutors in Philadelphia, had been mentored by King.
As a baby DA, when you first came to the office, he was a legend. He had tried these really complicated murders, that were in the front page. And, they go, that's Roger King.
Eventually, Carlos ended up getting involved in this case as a prosecutor. But initially, he was just a spectator, sitting in the gallery, watching Roger King's last performance, as he put it. Roger died back in 2016. The headline to his obituary read, "Roger King, 72, larger than life." And I should tell you, his legacy was complicated. In a number of other murder cases that he tried, his convictions were later overturned. There were allegations that he hid evidence, manipulated witnesses, or otherwise broke the rules. Carlos told me Roger was not the kind of guy who would have been intimidated by anyone, that he was tough, and that he was always ready for anything.
A lot of homicide prosecutors are armed. So, Roger always carried 2 guns.
Why 2?
Because Roger is Roger.
And then there was Roger's opponent, Mike Farrell. Carlos remembers how Mike carried himself in the courtroom.
He was very, very intense. He's not a bully because he's very gentle, but he looks like he'd run up and punch you. Like he really, you see the veins popping in his neck and everything like that.
So, that was the scene in the courtroom. Larger-than-life Roger King, who liked to carry his 2 guns, and the self-proclaimed crooked-face Irishman, veins ready to pop out of his neck. 2 impassioned lawyers getting ready. Prelude to an epic standoff. The trial would hinge on 2 fundamental questions. Number 1, did it really happen? In other words, do you believe that in 1989, Tom Guybeson went to Philadelphia and murdered a complete stranger? The answer to this question would depend on the credibility of 3 star witnesses. There were the 2 ex-girlfriends, both of whom claimed that Tom had confessed to them. And there was the old friend, Craig Peterson, who claimed to be the accomplice. These witnesses would have to convince the jury that Tom had committed murder back in 1989. Then there was question number 2. Was this the correct victim? In other words, was there enough evidence to convict Tom Guybeson specifically for the murder of Aaron Wood? And the answer to this question would focus on the detective work performed by Scott Duffy, Terry Mortimer, and the Philadelphia PD. The burden of proof was on the prosecution, and this was a point that Mike made, both in his opening arguments and in the little reenactment that he did for me.
Now, in a criminal case, it's very interesting in the sense that the prosecution side of the story, they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. As to the defense side of the story, we just have to create reasonable doubt. But we did way more than that.
Ultimately, Mike would present his own theory on how and why Aaron Wood was killed. But his main job was simply to poke holes in the prosecution's case, starting with the credibility of its 3 star witnesses. Let's start by talking about the testimony of the 2 ex-girlfriends. If you recall, one of them was from high school. Her name was Jen. Tom was her prom date. And when she took the witness stand, she testified that Tom had shown off his spiderweb tattoo on a number of occasions, including at the prom, and that Tom had been very clear. This tattoo was a badge of honor for killing a black man. Jen also claimed that Tom kept a newspaper article covering the man's death and boasted that this was his doing, his murder. Jen testified, quote, "He told me that he was driving aimlessly and a man just walked out between two parked cars and he shot him in the head." Jen said her relationship with Tom ended because he was abusive. The other ex-girlfriend was Patricia. She was Tom's girlfriend when he was older, in his 20s. Patricia also testified to the fact that Tom liked to show off his tattoo and brag about the murder that he'd committed. She also talked about the newspaper article that Tom supposedly kept. She also alleged Tom had abused her in a brutal manner. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but the allegations were graphic, specific, and disturbing. Carlos Vega, who you heard from earlier and who eventually got involved in this case as a prosecutor, said that Jen and Patricia showed real courage, not only for taking the stand, but for risking the potential consequences.
Think of it. If they were intimate with him, they know who he is. They know what he is. People don't understand. It's not TV that it's cut and everybody's happy. There is a life after a case. And people have to live the rest of their lives dealing with the murderer, his family, his friends, his associates. They're going to have to look behind their back for the rest of their lives.
Mike, the defense lawyer, argued that both of these women had been cast aside by Tom, that they were, quote, scorned girlfriends. In particular, Mike attacked Patricia's credibility, noted that she'd struggled with substance abuse for years, and pointed out that Tom had cheated on her repeatedly.
You know, he was not a faithful boyfriend, but he was not a murderer.
Mike maintained that both ex-girlfriends were lying on the stand to get back at Tom. In cross-examination, Mike did his best to poke holes in the ex-girlfriend's stories by pointing out inconsistencies. Over the preceding years, Jen and Patricia had told their stories multiple times to investigators and court officials, and there were some discrepancies. Patricia and Jen both testified at trial about seeing Tom's spiderweb tattoo. But years earlier, Patricia had originally told investigators that the tattoo that Tom got for the murder was a teardrop within a spiderweb.
Well, the theory of the girlfriends, the theory that began this whole snowball rolling down the side of a snow-covered hill was not to earn the web tattoo, but to earn a red teardrop within the web tattoo.
For the record, Tom did have a web tattoo, but there was no teardrop in it. Mike found things like this, small inconsistencies, and hammered away at them. In my mind, the most confounding issue that Mike raised involved the newspaper article about the murder, the one that Tom allegedly kept. This article was important because, in theory, if Iran Wood was the victim, then this article would have Iran's name in it, right? Because it would be about Iran. But no one, not the feds or the police or the prosecutors, was able to find such an article, not at Tom's house or the library or anywhere. It's a loose end that remains unexplained. And according to Mike Farrell, this was another hole in the prosecution's case. More on the prosecution after the break. By far, the most important witness was Craig Peterson, the supposed accomplice. He was really the linchpin to the prosecution's case. When Craig finally walked into the courtroom, it was a dramatic moment. Craig and Tom had been friends since the 4th grade. They knew each other's families. They'd grown up alongside one another in Delaware. And if Craig was to be believed, they'd finished out their adolescence by committing murder together. Now, almost 2 decades later, the former friends were in their late 30s. One was the defendant, possibly facing life in prison. The other, the star witness, who had a get-out-of-jail-free card. When he took the stand, Craig described the night of the murder in detail, just as he had done with Scott and Terry, the 2 federal agents 2 years prior. It was the same story, that he had helped to kill a man, all because of the color of his skin, and that he had watched as Tom Gibson shot him in the head. And then, as Craig told the jury, he, quote, slowly drove off like nothing happened and just kept going.
Craig Peterson was a liar. He was a corrupt source. Frankly, he was given an offer that no one could refuse.
This is the argument that the defense made at trial, that Craig lied to the federal agents, Scott and Terry, to save his own skin.
If, in fact, their theory was that he was the driver of Tom Gibson to Philadelphia from Wilmington to kill a black man, he's a co-conspirator in first-degree murder. It's life without parole.
So your contention is that they explicitly threatened him or said, you're going to go away from murder if you don't cooperate with us?
It's not my theory, Jake. It's the truth. It's exactly what happened. Mr. Peterson, didn't you drive Tom Gibson to Philadelphia to kill black men? No. Second time, didn't you drive Tom Gibson to Philadelphia to kill black men? No. Third time, well, look, you're facing life without parole, first-degree murder, co-conspirator, but we'll let you go scot-free with total immunity if you essentially tell us what we want to hear.
It is true that initially Craig denied taking part in this murder when Scott and Terry made that trip to Vermont. But it's also true that once he confessed, his story, with all its many details, remained consistent. In the courtroom, under cross-examination, Craig held his own. At one point, Mike asked him pointedly, "You decided to tell them what they want to hear, that you'd get immunity and not have to worry about prosecution, correct?" Craig replied, "I didn't tell them what they wanted to hear. I told them what happened." It's impossible to underscore just how important Craig was as a witness. In order to convict Tom Gibson, the jury would not only have to believe that Craig was credible, they would also have to believe that Craig's memory was reliable. Because all the details that connected this murder to Ron Wood came from Craig's confession. Scott, Terry, and Luby, the detective from the Philly PD, all testified for the prosecution. They walked the jury through the years of work they'd done to bring this cold case out of the basement, literally, and into the courtroom. Talked about how several key facts from Craig's confession, the general location, the type of weapon, the nature of the wound, and the time frame, spring of '89, led them to a single match, Ron Wood. But in the end, it would all come down to a gut feeling about Craig. The prosecution presented him as someone with a checkered past who'd finally redeemed himself and told the truth. The defense was calling him a liar and an opportunist. It would be up to the jury to decide. After the prosecution rested, Mike Farrell had an opportunity to present his own witnesses, to build out an alternate theory of how Ron Wood died, to suggest that Tom wasn't the one who killed him. His counter-narrative is a bit spotty. Not all of it connects, but I'm going to walk you through it.
Aaron Wood, who was supposedly the victim, Tom Gibson didn't kill him. Drugs and guns killed him.
Mike called a bunch of witnesses to build out his theory that Ron was murdered over a drug debt. One of these witnesses was an old girlfriend of Ron's. She testified that Iran sold drugs and that she'd once received a threatening phone call from a guy who was looking for Iran. In response, Roger King pointed out that this call occurred more than a year before the murder. So he argued connecting these two events was a real stretch. Mike brought in other witnesses too, including a bartender who'd seen Iran on the night of the murder in an agitated state.
We proved that Aaron Wood was in a bar, nervous, afraid, indicating that he may never come back.
The bartender recalled Iran saying, quote, "You probably won't be seeing me no more, man, after today." It went on like this. Mike brought in someone who had been interviewed by the police back in 1989 at the scene of the crime.
And we have an eyewitness heard the gunshot and saw 3 black males in hoods running from the scene of the gunshot.
On cross-examination, Roger asked this witness if he thought the 3 men in hoods running away were involved in the crime. "No," said the witness. This man also admitted in a moment of absurdity that he had no idea why he was being called to testify because he knew nothing about this murder. Okay, at this point, if you're scratching your head trying to keep all this straight, I hear you. Information overload. That, however, seemed to be part of the defense's strategy here. Mike wasn't offering complete answers or a counter-narrative that made total sense, and he didn't have to. He was just trying to seed doubts in the jurors' minds. I should mention, Tom Guybeson never took the witness stand. He waived his right to testify, so the jury never heard from him. The trial would last for 12 days, and as the lawyers sparred and the witnesses testified, one man in the gallery watched on silently. He was there every day, from start till finish, taking it all in. That man was Tyrone Wood, Iran's youngest brother.
I felt like I had to go to the trial every day, and I feel like I had to find the truth for not only for the family, but for my mom. Because she said, "Should I go?" And I said, no.
No, because he didn't want her hearing all the details, reliving the whole nightmare. So he went instead, though it was no easy task for him either. In the lead up to the trial, kind of amazingly, no one had shared any details with him. The whole story about Tom and Craig and the prom and the tattoos, that was all news to him. Tyrone intently listened to all the witnesses, especially Craig, and he found him credible. It was a torturous situation. On the one hand, Craig's testimony is what made this whole trial possible. He was the key to the family's shot at justice, or at least at closure. On the other hand, Craig was also the man who supposedly helped kill Iran, the man who drove away, quote, like nothing happened. I asked Tyrone how he felt about Craig testifying.
I was actually thinking that I was glad he did, at least for my family and for my mother mainly. So at least they can close their eyes knowing that they knew who did it. And that's the way I look at it also. I just thank God for that I knew who did it.
Occasionally during the trial, Tyrone found himself looking right at Tom Guybeson, looking and thinking.
I said, I'm not going to let him win. I just wanted you to be convicted of my brother's death. You did it. You know you did it. So, and I felt like he was a coward. You know, because you didn't face no man. You went up and just shot a man just because, for sport. I don't hate, but I was kind of hating for a little bit. And then at the same token, I thought to myself, I can't let this guy overtake me again. So I'm thinking that we're going to get justice and then everything will be okay.
His family's hopes, just like Tom's fate, were now in the hands of 12 Philadelphians. It was their call. They had to sort through the witnesses' testimonies, the narrative, the counter-narrative, the lofty rhetoric of Roger King, the doubts sowed by Mike Farrell, all in search of the elusive prospect that, buried somewhere in this tangled, tragic mess, was a verdict that was truly just. Next time on Deep Cover.
My name is Bob. I'm a Philadelphian, and I was selected to serve on the jury that heard the case of Thomas Guybeson.
Pressure was growing within the group to come to a conclusion. There was a feeling of we don't have more to go on.
Deep Cover is produced by Amy Gaines McQuaid and Jacob Smith. It's edited by Karen Shakurji. Mastering by Jake Gorski. Our show art was designed by Sean Carney. Original scoring and our theme was composed by Luis Guerra. Fact-checking by Arthur Gompertz. Our story consultant was James Foreman Jr. Special thanks to Jerry Williams, Sarah Nix, Greta Cohn, and Jake Flanagan. I'm Jake Halpern.